Michael Powell's 1960 masterpiece turned every moviegoer into an unwitting accomplice to murder. Through revolutionary point-of-view cinematography, Peeping Tom forced audiences to see through the killer's camera lens, literally becoming the weapon that claimed each victim's life. Critics have described this as a form of psychological warfare against the very people paying to watch. The technique proved too disturbing for critics and audiences alike. When the film premiered, reviewers didn't just pan it, they declared it morally repugnant. Derek Hill famously wrote that the only thing more nauseating than the film itself was the mind that conceived it. The backlash was swift and devastating. Powell, previously celebrated for classics like The Red Shoes, found himself blacklisted from the British film industry almost overnight. What made the film so transgressive wasn't just its violence, but its meta-commentary on voyeurism itself. Powell deliberately implicated viewers in the killer's crimes, making them active participants rather than passive observers. The camera becomes the killer's eye, and the audience is forced to see through it, a concept that proved decades ahead of its time. The Freudian themes of childhood trauma and scopophilia were equally unsettling. The killer's psychological makeup, rooted in his father's twisted experiments, created a disturbing portrait of how violence breeds violence. Studios refused to hire Powell afterward, forcing him to work on low-budget projects abroad. His career never recovered from the single, boundary-shattering film that dared to make murder a collaborative act. Stanley Kubrick transformed censorship into cinema's most provocative marketing campaign. When adapting Nabokov's scandalous novel, the director faced an impossible challenge. How does one sell a film about forbidden desire that couldn't actually show what made it notorious? The answer became legendary. How did they ever make a movie of Lolita? This tagline didn't hide from controversy. It weaponized it. Kubrick's marketing team positioned the film's very existence as a miraculous achievement, turning production code restrictions into selling points rather than obstacles. Casting 14-year-old Sue Lyon proved equally strategic. Her contract explicitly prohibited scenes suggesting underage sexuality, forcing Kubrick to rely on psychological tension over explicit content. Lyon's wardrobe and makeup emphasized teenage sophistication rather than childhood innocence, walking a razor-thin line between artistic integrity and commercial viability. The campaign's genius lay in suggestion over revelation. Posters featured Lyon's face, framed by heart-shaped sunglasses, capturing the film's themes of obsession without crossing censorship boundaries. Every promotional material teased what audiences couldn't see, making imagination more powerful than any explicit imagery. Kubrick understood that forbidden fruit tastes sweetest when it remains just out of reach. His psychological approach transformed Humbert's internal torment into cinematic gold, proving that sometimes the most effective way to break taboos is to make audiences complicit in wanting them broken. Many critics argue that today's studios would never touch such material, a testament to how drastically Hollywood's risk tolerance has shifted since 1962. Two seconds of non-sexualized nudity in a Holocaust flashback shattered 34 years of Hollywood's moral gatekeeping. Sidney Lumet's 1964 drama The Pawnbroker featured a brief scene where concentration camp survivor Saul Nazarman recalls the traumatic moment guards forced him to watch his wife's humiliation, a memory that haunts his present-day existence as a Harlem pawnbroker. The Production Code Administration initially rejected the film outright, declaring any nudity violated their standards regardless of context. But Lumet and producer Ely Landau weren't backing down. They assembled a detailed defense arguing the scene's historical necessity, complete with survivor testimonies and documentation proving such atrocities occurred in Nazi camps. Lumet emphasized the scene's importance, explaining that it had to be included because it was the only way to show the depth of his character's suffering. He stressed it wasn't about nudity, but about the horror of what the character had experienced. The filmmakers reframed their battle as one between artistic truth and moral absolutism. The appeal process became a watershed moment. In a 6-3 vote, the Code's Appeals Board granted the first major exception to the nudity prohibition, establishing that artistic merit could officially override moral regulations. This precedent cracked the foundation of Hollywood's censorship system. The decision rippled through the industry immediately. Studios realized the Code's authority was no longer absolute, emboldening filmmakers to push other boundaries. The Library of Congress later recognized the significance. adding The Pawnbroker to the National Film Registry in 2020 for paving the way for more mature storytelling in American cinema. Gualtiero Jacopetti and Franco Prosperi's 1962 Italian picture pioneered a disturbing new business model, manufacturing outrage through carefully orchestrated deception, then marketing it as fearless journalism. The directors openly admitted their approach blended fiction with reality, with Prosperi later claiming their work revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature, despite relying heavily on stage scenarios. The filmmakers' methods were brazenly manipulative. Their infamous shark fishing sequence used dead sharks for close-up shots to simulate danger, while the New Guinea pig feast was entirely fabricated. Locals were paid to perform discontinued rituals, with editing implying cannibalism where none existed. These weren't documentary shortcuts, they were calculated lies, designed to reinforce Western audiences' preconceptions about primitive cultures. Jacopetti defended their tactics by claiming they wanted to show the world in all its beauty and ugliness without any censorship. Yet their version of uncensored truth consistently portrayed non-Western societies as savage spectacles for European consumption. The production's success spawned dozens of imitators, creating an entire genre built on exploiting cultural differences for shock value. Multiple countries banned the work for its racist portrayals and fabricated cruelty, but audiences flocked to it as forbidden entertainment. Modern scholars now recognize Mondo Cane as a precursor to contemporary misinformation crises, noting how it normalized the monetization of fabricated truths, decades before social media made such manipulation commonplace. The picture's most lasting damage wasn't its individual deceptions, but its proof that audiences would pay premium prices for lies disguised as documentary revelation. William Wyler's 1961 drama dared to restore what censors had stripped from his own 1936 adaptation, the lesbian relationship that Lillian Hellman's original play centered around. Where the earlier version transformed same-sex attraction into a heterosexual affair to appease moral guardians, this remake confronted audiences with Martha's tortured confession of love for her best friend Karen. Critics argue that the film's tragedy wasn't just Martha's self-inflicted death following her admission, it was how Wyler inadvertently reinforced the very prejudice he sought to condemn. Shirley MacLaine's devastating performance as Martha captured the anguish of a woman destroyed by her own feelings, but contemporary viewers would be horrified by the narrative's insistence that homosexual love leads inevitably to shame and destruction. Modern critics argue that the film's adherence to the bury your gays trope, where queer characters must suffer or perish for their sexuality, makes it complicit in the bigotry it supposedly critiques. Wyler defended his approach by emphasizing that the real villains were the accusers, not the accused. He positioned Martha's tragedy as an indictment of societal cruelty, rather than divine punishment for deviance. However, the production code's mandate that perverse lifestyles couldn't be portrayed as acceptable forced the director into a narrative corner where Martha's feelings became a source of misery, rather than potential joy. Audrey Hepburn reportedly struggled with her character's implications, while MacLaine embraced the role's emotional complexity despite its problematic framework. The film's lasting impact lies in this contradiction, progressive enough to acknowledge lesbian desire explicitly, yet trapped within moral structures that guaranteed its tragic conclusion. Russ Meyer's 1965 exploitation masterpiece turned the damsel in distress trope inside out, unleashing three go-go dancers who murdered, controlled, and dominated every man they encountered with sadistic pleasure. Varla, Rosie, and Billy weren't victims waiting for rescue. They were apex predators who viewed men as playthings to be broken and discarded. Meyer struggled to cast actresses willing to embrace such unapologetically vicious roles, eventually finding Tura Setana, a former stripper and martial artist who brought genuine physicality to Varla's bone-crushing violence. The director wanted women who could believably overpower men twice their size, creating fight scenes where traditional gender dynamics collapsed entirely. These weren't accidental role reversals. Meyer deliberately crafted a world where feminine sexuality became a weapon of destruction. Mainstream theaters rejected the picture's combination of nudity and violence, while early feminist groups dismissed it as misogynistic exploitation despite its female-dominated narrative. This left Meyer's creation stranded in a cultural no-man's land, too transgressive for conservative audiences, yet too sexually explicit for progressive movements that might have embraced its gender subversion. The production found new life during the midnight movie circuit of the 70s, where cult audiences celebrate its campy dialogue and over-the-top performances. Modern feminist scholars remain divided. Some argue the work empowers women through physical dominance, while others contend it merely sexualizes violence for male consumption. Quentin Tarantino's later homages in Kill Bill proved Meyer's influence endured, though contemporary filmmakers rarely match his commitment to making female characters genuinely, irredeemably monstrous. Sam Peckinpah's 1969 Western transformed cinematic carnage into choreographed artistry, using revolutionary techniques that made every bullet wound a brushstroke in his violent masterpiece. The director employed multiple cameras, running at different speeds, creating the slow-motion death sequences that became his signature. Critics have noted that this technique may have been inspired by Akira Kurosawa, but pushed to unprecedented extremes. Peckinpah's innovation lay in treating violence as opera rather than action. Each gunfight became a meticulously planned dance, with squibs exploding in perfect synchronization while editors cut between normal speed and slow motion to create hypnotic rhythms. The famous Bridge Massacre required over 300 squibs and took 6 days to film, producing footage so graphic that Warner Brothers executives demanded cuts before release. Critics split violently over Peckinpah's methods. Pauline Kael praised the director's poetic brutality, arguing that his stylized approach revealed violence's true horror by making audiences confront its consequences. Conversely, Judith Crist accused him of being a pornographer of violence, who disguised sadism as artistic expression. Some psychologists and critics suggested that slow-motion death sequences might desensitize viewers to real violence. Peckinpah defended his approach by claiming that sanitized movie violence was more dangerous than his graphic realism. He argued that showing blood and pain honestly would discourage rather than promote violent behavior. Critics widely acknowledged that this philosophy influenced generations of filmmakers, from Martin Scorsese to Quentin Tarantino, who embraced the notion that stylized violence could serve as both entertainment and moral commentary, forever blurring the line between artistry and exploitation. Arthur Penn's 1967 masterpiece transformed two Depression-era bank robbers into folk heroes, sparking America's most heated debate about violence in cinema. Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway didn't just play criminals, they made murder look fashionable, turning real-life killers into sympathetic rebels fighting an oppressive system. The film's revolutionary finale shocked audiences with its balletic brutality. Penn's slow-motion death sequence, where machine gun bullets tear through the protagonist's bodies, created a new visual language for screen violence that critics found deeply disturbing. New York Times critic Bosley Crowther condemned the sequence as a piece of cheap sensationalism, arguing that such graphic imagery had no place in mainstream entertainment. What truly alarmed establishment critics wasn't the violence itself, it was how audiences responded. Young moviegoers cheered for Bonnie and Clyde's crime spree, viewing their bank robberies as acts of rebellion against corporate greed and government authority. The film arrived during Vietnam War protests and civil rights upheaval, when traditional authority figures faced unprecedented challenges to their legitimacy. Penn's decision to romanticize actual murderers crossed ethical boundaries that previous filmmakers had respected. Unlike fictional anti-heroes, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow had killed innocent people, yet the movie presented their violence as justified resistance against an unjust society. This moral ambiguity reflected broader cultural shifts where rebellious outsiders became more appealing than lawmen and politicians. The film's massive success among younger demographics signaled Hollywood's recognition that countercultural audiences crave stories celebrating defiance over conformity, forever changing how cinema portrayed crime and punishment. John Schlesinger's 1969 drama achieved what remains impossible today, winning Best Picture despite carrying cinema's most restrictive rating. The Academy's decision to honor an X-rated film marked a singular moment when artistic merit trumped commercial considerations, creating a precedent that modern Hollywood refuses to repeat. Schlesinger embraced the controversy, later telling the BBC that the X rating was a badge of honor because it meant we were doing something right. His defiant stance reflected the film's unflinching approach to depicting male prostitution and urban desperation without sanitizing harsh realities for mainstream comfort. Jon Voight, who transformed into naive hustler Joe Buck, described the role as forcing him to confront my own vulnerabilities, acknowledging how the character's sexual ambiguity challenged both actor and audience expectations. The rating stemmed not from explicit imagery, but from thematic content that censors deemed too disturbing for general audiences. Schlesinger and editor Hugh Robertson deliberately framed sexual encounters ambiguously, yet the MPAA still imposed the X classification due to language and implied homosexual themes that mainstream cinema typically avoided. According to biographers and oral histories, Schlesinger reportedly joked backstage at the 1970 Oscar ceremony that winning with an X-rated picture would give the censors a heart attack. His prediction proved prophetic. No X-rated or NC-17 film has since claimed Best Picture, as studios now view such ratings as commercial suicide rather than artistic validation. The film's 50-year legacy demonstrates how drastically industry priorities have shifted, transforming what was once considered a courageous artistic statement into an unthinkable business risk. Robert Aldrich's 1967 war epic shattered every convention about heroism by recruiting society's most despicable outcasts for a suicide mission against Nazi officers. The picture's 12 protagonists weren't square-jawed patriots. They were convicted murderers, rapists, and psychopaths pulled from military prison to serve as expendable weapons in a morally bankrupt strategy. Aldrich deliberately crafted characters who challenged audiences' sympathies, forcing viewers to root for men whose crimes would normally inspire revulsion. Ernest Borgnine later captured this contradiction in interviews, describing the essence as ultimate patriotism emerging from society's rejects, highlighting how the production weaponized moral ambiguity against traditional war movie expectations. The director pushed his cast through brutal military training to capture authentic brutality, encouraging improvisation during fight scenes that amplified the story's raw cynicism. Critics condemned the production for transforming reprehensible criminals into sympathetic anti-heroes, particularly the character Maggot, whose history of sexual violence was treated as mere character background rather than serious moral failing. The original script included more explicit references to his crimes, but test audiences reacted so negatively that producers softened the details while maintaining the implications. Religious groups and moral watchdogs attacked the picture's suggestion that victory required embracing the enemy's own viciousness, calling it a dangerous erosion of wartime ethics. A 2023 retrospective in The New Yorker argued that modern audiences would never tolerate a movie that so casually dismisses sexual offense as a footnote to heroic redemption, making Aldrich's moral gamble a relic of less sensitive times. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.